what you got to share with us. If you guys have never been to one of these meetings before, we've been holding them for over the past 2 years now. We've got kind of a system down where we meet in person twice a year, and then we'll do these Skype sessions roughly every month or so. And it's all about SharePoint and Office 365 and trying to network with other agencies and cities and counties to see what everybody else is doing and kind of learn off each other. Joe's been really helpful in organizing this, and he's kind of been our backbone throughout this whole process, and really appreciate his help. And then Lorna with the City of Bellevue, she's also been really helpful in kind of pushing us forward and keep trying to set these meetings up. So just welcome. I hope you guys learned something, and kind of the goal is for us to really just kind of create a community amongst the agencies and the cities and counties. So take it away, Steve.
Well, let me throw in one caveat real quick about our next meeting. So our next meeting we just kind of scheduled this morning with Rob. I believe it's March 21st. I could be wrong, but we'll have it on the meetup page soon. I'll do that later today. Rob, can you talk a little bit about what you're going to be speaking about?
Yeah, I think the day we're looking at is the 28th. So I think it was the 28th. Yeah. So we just recently finished our SharePoint deployment. So I'm kind of going to be doing a little sort of from the trenches, fresh from the battlefield of Office 365 SharePoint deployment, and give a little overview of our process and our sort of our wants and desires and outcomes, and then just do a little Q&A. If you guys want to give me questions or whatever, I can answer them directly, but just, answer any questions you may have about the process and how things went, and then sort of do a little show and tell of how things ended up.
Cool. And that should be an in-person meeting in the City of Bellevue. I'd welcome all of you to make that commute out. Details TBD, so don't schedule your hotel or anything like that quite yet. I won't be able to make it in person, but in our last meeting and the meeting before that were in person, we did have Skype support, so you can, or you hopefully should be able to dial in. And I want to do a quick shout out to Jason Hale for making all of that possible. With that, Stephen, please take it away.
Great, thanks. So I noticed that there was a notice that came up and said someone's having a problem seeing the screen, and so I was kind of trying to flip over and trying to help, but I'll leave that up to you. All right, well, just a reminder, this is being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, your voice, then go ahead and type your questions in as we go along. We will be taking questions as we go through the presentation, so feel free to put those in there. It'd be great. It works better that way than having them at the end when there's crickets and no one can remember what they're going to ask. So. Just a brief intro for myself. I've worked for the City of Bellingham in Washington State for almost about 20 years now, and I manage the public website and intranet, staff intranet, and then I do manage projects as assigned. So that's my background, and I've worked with SharePoint since about SharePoint 2007 all the way up through SharePoint Online. So that's a little bit about me. And today we're going to be talking about public anonymous forms for SharePoint, and how we've adopted Cognito Forms as a solution for helping us get from SharePoint 2016 on-prem to SharePoint Online. So we'll proceed. So here's a quick outline. I promise there's only 12 slides, and there's a demo involved. So I wanted to talk briefly about the value of public anonymous forms for SharePoint and why we're doing it, a history of SharePoint forms at our agency, why we decided to migrate to SharePoint Online from on-prem, and the SharePoint Online form solutions that we looked at. And then also why we deferred migrating to SharePoint Online for a bit of time, talk about a couple of points around that. And also talking about Nintex Live Forms. We replaced that as our form solution and why we did that and when. And then how we selected Cognito Forms, why we went with them. And then talk a little bit about what is it like after 6 months of using Cognito, and then a little bit about the future of SharePoint Online Forms, that we see some potential changes, and then there'll be some resource links at the end that you can follow up if you want. All right, so these are just some of the things, highlights. It's not exhaustive, but one of the things that we've found is that having a public anonymous forms for SharePoint is a better solution than mail-to forms or fillable PDFs. So in the past, what people have done is they've had an email address on our web page, and people would send an email request in to report a problem or to ask a question or things like that. And the problem is you don't have structured. You can't force them to include certain information. It gets lost in email. Only one person gets the email, or if a bunch of people get the email, then who answers it? That kind of a thing. So there's also with the fillable PDFs, we're really trying to move people away from using PDFs because often PDFs mean paper ultimately in some of our workflows. So we're trying to move off of that. And then also, once you get the form submission into SharePoint, you really have a familiar interface for a lot of cities, for our agency staff, where they can easily filter and sort and search and edit the form data, export it to Excel, and then do simple reporting with views and things like that in SharePoint. So the flexibility that SharePoint brings with its custom lists is something people are familiar with in our agency. And I'll talk a little bit more about why you can do some of those things in online form solutions, but why we chose to do it in SharePoint. And then once you get into SharePoint, you can also tap into workflows for SharePoint, either SharePoint native workflow solutions or third-party solutions, which Mintex, we'll be talking a little bit about that. And then also Flow, which I've seen, just from my perspective, I think Flow is expanding rapidly and really is a great way to integrate with a lot of third-party solutions, especially hosted solutions. Also, no custom dev required for at least for simple use cases. So, when you get a little more fancy and you have to integrate it with a GIS system or something like that, you might be looking at additional work. But if you're doing simple use cases, you can get by without having to crack open and do any JavaScript or HTML or there are some solutions that we have in our enterprise that require hand coding public forms. For example, our on-base forms document management system, requires for the public anonymous forms to be hand coded. So, and then also one of the things that we've really found useful for this is some people might say, well, it just doesn't quite do this, or I wish it did that, or why would you do that instead of just an email? It provides an interim solution oftentimes. So sometimes you don't have the timeline for your project to implement the full online, custom vertical app that has all of the online forms, like say a permitting system, for example, or a customer relations management system like SeeClickFix or something. Maybe you're spinning that up, getting budget approved, things like that. But in the meantime, you're struggling with a bunch of emails coming in, a bunch of paper forms coming in, that kind of a thing. So this is really good for that interim period where you're getting enough requests where you need to start to manage them, but it's not enough to either justify the budget for a larger custom application, or it's just the timing of it. You need some sort of stopgap, and we found this to be super helpful for that, especially for things that are term limited. So, the city council had a vacancy open, and they wanted all of this information, and it had to be structured and collected, but it was for a 2-week process, right? And we got 30 submissions, but they needed that type of business requirement. We were able to spin it up and get it working for them same day. So things like that the quick and dirty stuff, where you're not getting into custom development and integrating a bunch of line of business systems, it's really great for that we found. All right, here's a quick history on forms at the City of Bellingham. We migrated from Lotus Notes, yes, Notes, East Coasters, anybody out there, and we went to SharePoint in 2007, and we just used the basic SharePoint forms that were built into there and content types to kind of hide and show fields, so it was pretty basic when we first started out with forms. By 2011, we migrated to SharePoint 2010, which offered SharePoint Designer, where you could get in there and kind of fiddle with the look and feel of forms, and also had a workflow engine designer as well. So we started using that. And then in 2013, we were on SharePoint 2013 by then. SharePoint Designer dropped its visual form editor feature. So no longer could you drag and drop and kind of do conditional formatting and things like that easily. You had to get in there to to hand code it, if you will, to mark it up and so forth. And then we started experimenting with InfoPath in 2013, just with a handful of forms. In 2014, Microsoft announced InfoPath would be discontinued, so that didn't last long. We basically felt like, hey, we're not going to get on that ship if it's sinking, even though, of course, Microsoft announced support well into 2012. I don't know what it was. It was like 2020, 2025 or something. I don't know. Anyway, it's well into the future, but we didn't want to get onto something where they're not going to be developing it anymore and enhancing it, and they also don't promise compatibility on certain versions of SharePoint and so forth. And so in 2014, we were looking for a replacement for SharePoint Designer, which never really worked that well anyway, and we purchased Nintex, and it was we felt like it was a great value at $15K for the license, and then about between $5,000 and $6,000 a year for software assurance. So that was a pill that we could swallow pretty easily, and it was awesome. We were off to the races, and part of that bundle of Nintex workflow and forms bundle, they had a product called Nintex Live Forms. And the cool thing about that was it was public anonymous forms for SharePoint finally. I mean, we did not have anything that wasn't custom dev that would give us that kind of rapid forms development that we could push to the public. So that Nintex Live Forms solution was really exciting for us. We got a number of forms out there. It was working well. And that was 2014. And in 2016, we went to SharePoint 2016. And then we started saying, hey, we're on 2016. We've done a number of SharePoint upgrades on-prem. This SharePoint Online's been around for a couple of years. Why? Are we going to move to SharePoint Online? Are we going to stay on-prem? And here are some of the top. Of course, this is a really complex, and we could have a robust discussion about this for a couple of weeks. But here's some of the highlights of why we looked at SharePoint Online. External sharing for collaboration was one of the key customer requests. And then a significant reduction in the system complexity. So, maintaining a server farm on-prem, I'm so looking forward to getting rid of it, quite frankly, and giving that over to Microsoft Minions. I'm so happy about that. And then intranet availability. Just before some of you may have joined this call, we were having a discussion about why you wouldn't stay on-prem and you'd go hosted with, SharePoint Online, and part of that is for disaster preparedness. And then multi-factor authentication. So there's more and more concern over securing, especially as we start putting more sensitive information into SharePoint over time, securing that with multi-factor authentication, especially since we've had a number of attacks on our infrastructure recently. The target vector is they send the phishing emails, people give them their credentials, and then they're in, that kind of a thing. So because people use their email credentials as their network credentials, oftentimes in agencies, that can be an issue. You can have multi-factor authentication on-prem, of course, for SharePoint. There's different solutions, but the solutions that we're looking at were more expensive than just using the built-in Office 365 authentication that's offered for SharePoint Online by default. So that was one of the key factors of us looking at that. And then delivery of features, on-prem is behind. I think all of us recognize that. And some of us feel that feature delay because we're in the government cloud as well. So it's not necessarily as quick as the enterprise cloud for SharePoint Online features, but it is faster than on-prem. At least that's been my experience. So in 2016, we decided that would be our last SharePoint 2016 on-prem server. Enterprise server would be our last upgrade. That's the plan. So in 2016, we're like, if we're going to SharePoint Online, we got to figure out how to replace what we're doing on-prem. And one of the things we were looking at was, what are we going to do for forms? And Nintex, and just to caveat this, or to disclaim this, things change rapidly, and I do have some later slides that talk about some changes in the industry. But this is point in time in 2016. The Nintex cloud offerings were quite expensive. Just for the same product package, if you will, it would be about 10 times as expensive. So we were talking between $40,000 and $60,000, and that's for limited forms. So that was not an all-you-can-eat like our on-prem packages right now today. You get so many workflows and so many forms. And then also the feature parity wasn't there between the on-prem and the cloud products. for Nintex at that time in 2016, and then they really had no option that we were aware of that for public anonymous forms in the cloud. They had their Nintex Live forms on-prem, but not in the cloud. We looked at K2, K2's Appit product and other competing products, and they were expensive as well. It seemed like everybody took the advantage, took the opportunity. If we're going to the cloud, let's raise the prices. Everybody needs to raise all the prices. And anyway, it just seemed like there wasn't really a price competitive option that would replace Nintex on-prem for us. We were looking at Microsoft Power Apps and Flow, and at least in 2016 when we were looking at it, it really wasn't an Nintex replacement in our opinion. It was more of a, for mini apps instead of forms, which I think it's going to turn into a great solution for those. But for forms specifically in 2016, pretty clunky. No anonymous features in the Power Apps and Flow functionality there. Excuse me, the Power Apps for forms specifically. And it's not at the time, Power Apps and Flow were not available in the government cloud. So that's true today. But spoiler alert, that should be changing shortly if I understand correctly, and many of you may already be aware of that. And then we looked at Microsoft Forms, which was pretty basic, simple surveys and things like that. Didn't quite have the online forms designer tools that we wanted. So we didn't see any good options for Office 365 for forms and workflow in 2016. So looking at that, because of the expense in 2017, because of all the expense of those options, and because Flow and Power Apps were still not available in the government cloud in 2017, there were Microsoft announced hub and communication sites. Those are modern sites for SharePoint Online versus the classic SharePoint Online sites. They have a better, in my opinion, they have a block editing, better web page editing experience for users, for content editors and contributors. It was announced but wasn't available in the government cloud in 2017. So we're like, well, the hub sites bring primary nav and scope search, which we feel like we need for our intranet. Otherwise, it's kind of these islands of little team sites all over the place. The classic SharePoint site, just to be clear, the Kirkland is using the classic SharePoint site, and it does have primary nav and basically it's similar to on-prem that you can do with metadata and so forth for terms for navigation and so forth. But online at the time there wasn't really that option. And then we had a kind of a sticking point on OneDrive syncing. Windows 10 has specific features that we were waiting on, a specific build of Windows 10. So we still have Windows 8 systems out there, and even a few Windows 7 systems out there that we're still trying to replace. And because of that, we decided to postpone SharePoint Online migration in 2017. So that leaves us in 2018. So we're still in 2018. We were still waiting for Power Apps and Flow. And we're like, okay, but we felt like we did a forms and workflow project last year to look at kind of what's in our toolbox, what should we be using, how could we use it better, and one of the things that was identified is Nintex Live forms needed to be replaced. Excuse me. And so for the reasons behind that are the designer, the forms designer for now, and just to be clear, this is the Nintex Live forms. So this is the on-prem product that pushes a public anonymous form out to a Nintex-hosted website where anonymous forms can be submitted through that website. So it is not their modern current offerings for Office Online public anonymous forms. This is the one that's included in the product that we had at the time. So it wasn't responsive to mobile devices, and 50% of our traffic is mobile now. So that was a pretty big deal to us, and that's a couple years, in our opinion, should have been implemented a number of years ago. Most software as service form solutions offer that functionality. And then the data for Nintex Live forms is actually stored on Nintex vendor-hosted servers, and we had a number of incidents where the communication between the Nintex, the vendor servers, and our on-prem SharePoint server farm lost connectivity, and at least in one, possibly two cases there, they were unable to recover the data on their end. And we're talking about public disclosure requests, police tips, hearing mitigation requests, things like that matter if you don't respond to them. So that kind of left a bad taste in our mouth, and we're like, we need to get off Nintex Live Forms. We were fine with using Nintex Forms and workflow on-prem for now. It's meeting our main needs for that, but the live anonymous forms, it no longer was meeting our needs. So we were looking at selecting an option. We didn't have any specific product in mind. We just looked at the marketplace, and Nintex did have some modern offerings. I might get the product names wrong off the top of my head, but they have their universal forms, I think is what they're referring to. Maybe I'm misquoting that, but I think they basically have an Office 365 offering that does offer public anonymous forms, but they're expensive. At least in 2018, when we were making this decision, they're quite expensive. FormStack, it didn't have any direct SharePoint integration. I have heard that there are some people out there that have integrated it, but it required some custom dev, according to them. Gravity Forms was just kind of a really, hey, what's the cheapest thing that we can do out there? And we might be going to WordPress for some of our public websites. Maybe Gravity Forms makes sense, but there's no SharePoint integration. Again, dev or scripting or some sort of backend is going to be needed to connect that data to SharePoint. And then we looked at OnBasis as our document management system, and its form solution for public anonymous forms actually has to be hand-coded. And again, no simple integration with SharePoint, so you'd have to figure out getting the data from OnBase into SharePoint as well. So I was actually surprised. I had never heard of Cognito Forms before last year. They're a fairly new company. They were founded in 2013, I think, something like that. So they're about 5-6 years old. And it was hard to find them. I didn't searching, things like that. They weren't really recommended by a bunch of people. And then I came across some comparisons of online form solutions, and they were kind of started to show as being rated higher on the list of other products than other products. So I gave it a go. They had a free trial subscription, and it turned out they had a really nice forms designer, and it's really mobile friendly, super easy to embed in public websites, which was key to us. And it had a simple integration with SharePoint, SharePoint on-prem, online, and Microsoft Flow. And of course, it also includes, I think it's Zapier. How do you say that? I think it's Zapier. I haven't actually used their product. I've just looked at it. But the fact that the product could take care of this kind of bridge time when we're still on-prem, but we're putting our toe into online, and we're slowly moving team sites and so forth out to the SharePoint Online. How could we live in both worlds at the same time and still look forward into the future, not have to rebuild all our forms, that kind of a thing. So, and then the price was right, $1,000 a year. So if you get a year subscription, it's $1,000. If you get a month-to-month, I think it's $99, and that's for their most expensive version. And I'll go over in a little while here the pricing, but it's very reasonable, and they have a free one that you can test out the integration with if you want to play around with it. So we decided to go with Cognito, and so I'll spend a few minutes on kind of showing what we've done and why we did it. So the first business case that we looked at was, let me open this up real quick here. I misspelled, maybe it'll catch it for me. So we had a request for abandoned vehicles, and this was kind of an interesting request because this is a Cognito form embedded in our public website. We had a request from our police department where they work with volunteers. So they're volunteers that take paper forms out to the field and report on when people report abandoned vehicles, and they kind of check back and forth. There's a workflow there. So we wanted to streamline some of that, but we also wanted to keep some of it paper. So I'll just walk you through what we did. We created this form, and it's, I'm not going to go a lot of time. It's a basic form, and it does some. It can be conditional formatting, all that kind of stuff, all the nice stuff of a modern form solution it can do. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but basically this is what the public sees. They submit the form, and then on the SharePoint backend, this is the solution that happens to be on-prem, so it's being pushed into on-prem. And we literally just launched this yesterday. We went live yesterday, and I've hidden some of the columns just to protect privacy, but we already started getting requests in. But one of the nice things about this is you can go in and we're using the Nintex on-prem form solution, and by doing that, we can kind of get the pixel perfect. If you print the form, it will work for a single page. All the fields are where they want them, that kind of a thing. Gives you a little more control over that. Now, you don't have to use Nintex. You could certainly use SharePoint vanilla forms, but if you want any kind of conditional formatting, printability, formatting for printing, things like that, you'll want some sort of third-party product on-prem, at least for SharePoint, in my opinion, to be able to rapidly develop this kind of a form. I can kind of show you what that looks like in, this is the Nintex Forms Designer. It's pretty slick for a pixel perfect kind of layout. You drag and drop and so forth. I will say they do have a responsive version for this, but it's for internal forms only, not for their public anonymous forms. So internal forms only, you can build a responsive form if you want to, but most of our users are on desktops internally. And of course, one of the benefits of this now is then they can search by plate number, they can sort, filter, they can export, so forth. Before it was literally they had voicemail messages and paper forms and so forth. So this has helped out a lot. It's been well received. Yeah, so that's. And just to reemphasize, while this is printed and handed out to volunteers, it's a very special use case. It's because they require paper to go out and do, because of the demographic of the people who volunteer are a little bit older and aren't comfortable with technology and so forth, that we are trying to get people to avoid paper workflows, if you will. All right. So one of the things that, one of the questions that comes up is, well, Stephen, a lot of online form solutions offer simple, editing of the form data and simple notifications and things like that. Why would you want to pull it into SharePoint? Because you could just do that online, right? You basically can look at the entries online. A lot of these forms stack, and even Cognito Forms will let you do that. So what are some of the reasons you might choose to pull it into SharePoint anyway? One of the things is pricing. So oftentimes those online software service form solutions charge extra for workflow functionality and or logins. So with SharePoint, basically all of our city staff, we have about 800 plus, I think, they're all licensed for SharePoint. So there's no extra licensing cost or fee or separate login, which is another big gate. Single sign-on is available with SharePoint for us, whether it's on-prem or online. We have it set up so that they don't get prompted if they're on an agency computer or VPN to an agency network from a laptop. So there's no separate user password they have to remember. They don't have to look it up in their password vault. It just doesn't interrupt their workflow as they click from an email notification into looking at their online report or whatever other online submission that they're looking at. So that's a big one. And then also highly formatted print versions, at least for us, because we have Nintex as an option right now on-prem. Some of the software service form solutions online charge for the highly formatted printout, if you will, version of the form. Cognito gives you, I think, 10 free with a certain level, and then they start charging you. But they also give you the option to create simple printable forms that kind of lay themselves out. They're not pixel perfect, but they auto lay out, kind of like a responsive form for printing, if you will. All right. So another use case that I wanted to show you is that we have, for our public website, we have a residential parking. Every year people request parking permits, and part of that is they do it one time a year. It's for like a 3-week period, and it used to be all envelopes and paper. So they'd mail out the notices, everybody would get copies of their driver's license and all this stuff, and of course you got this stuff going through the mail, so you got pretty sensitive information, number one, going through the mail, number two, postage, and all the just the headaches, mailing. They wanted to streamline that, but this is an example, perfect example of where we have an online parking permitting system, but the online permit request solution wouldn't be available until later this year. And they needed to do this round of renewals of hundreds of permits in the fall of last year. So enter Cognito Forms in SharePoint. We built this out 2 days, I think it was, between all of the other workloads that we had, but we were able to turn around in about 2 days. And this is, again, the kind of a modern form where you can kind of see that it's conditional formatting and so forth, upload files, they can upload their driver's license and so forth, proof of insurance, and then they send the request. And once they've sent that request, it gets pushed to a SharePoint Online list in this case. So it's not on-prem in this case. And again, I've hidden some columns, and I won't be opening these up for details just for privacy purposes. But it basically pushes it, and it's practically instantaneous. So Cognito is actually hosted in Azure, and so is a Microsoft infrastructure. It's been pretty amazing to see how fast attachments and file uploads transfer. And I'm sorry, I am looking at some questions now. I apologize, I haven't been looking for these. Great that Power Apps and Flow was released in the GCC. I did hear that it was going to come out first quarter, so I'm glad it did. And looking forward to that. I have a dev tenant in the Enterprise Cloud that I'll show you Flow in today. Yes, Power Apps are not able to external users. And yes, 50% of our internal, or no, not internal traffic, 50% of our public website traffic is mobile now. So it is a smaller percentage internal, but publicly, yes, we hit the 50% mark this year. Let's see. Yes, $1,000. I'll go over pricing for Cognito, but Cognito is $1,000 for unlimited forms. I'll get over some of the, I'll give you a link to that as well. Our external website is in SharePoint. It does not matter for Cognito Forms. You can have any content management system. Cognito has a plugin for WordPress, and I can't remember what other, I'd have to look and see what other content management systems, but it has some embed code that's quite seamless. We use its embed code in our SharePoint public website, but by no means do you have to use that. As long as the content management solution for your public website allows embed code or iframing, you can use it. The embed code, the seamless embed code is way better, especially on mobile, but the iframing is a kind of a fallback, second best if you only have that option. I'll mention that in a minute here as well about SharePoint Online and how that comes into play. Yes, it has online payments. Cognito has online payments. We have not gone down that route because we have central online payment solution, but you could certainly go down that route for very small onesie-twosie things if you don't have an enterprise strategy for online payments, or you could potentially use it for a strategy if you don't have one for a central online payment solution. I can't speak in detail to that because we haven't gone down that route yet, but they do offer that. Great question about privacy. If you get the $1,000 subscription, you get HIPAA compliance, and you deal with your own public information requests. So you have complete access to all of your data, and you would need to export it and provide it if that was requested. All right, I think I'm caught up on questions. Thanks, those are great questions. So this is the SharePoint Online integration. It gets pushed directly into the list. And then, so an example, this doesn't have all the fields showing because I've suppressed them, but here's an example of where the public form doesn't have a status column, but we've added one so that people can track it here, meaning internal staff can track where they're at, whether they've been completed or not, and of course all the nice goodies with SharePoint. You can group, sort, filter, search, all that kind of stuff. And you can also, some online form solutions provide limited workflow, but if you get it into SharePoint, you can do some pretty amazing stuff with manipulating the form data and notifications and so forth. Right. I will look at the Flow integration now. I'll show you that. So I'm going to flip over to our dev tenant. We have kind of a parallel dev tenant to be able to test in Office 365, and this one is enterprise, so it's not limited by the GCC, the government cloud, getting things usually like a year or two or more later. So here's some flows. Here's an example. You can create a new blank flow, and I'll search for Cognito. They have an action, so you can say when a new entry is so when someone goes to a public Cognito form and they create a new entry, I can select this option to say, hey, when it's created, do something, or when it's been updated. In this case, I'll say, well, it's created, and it already has a connection to our Cognito tenant, or our Cognito subscription. So I can choose whatever form I want. I'll select one. I'll just do residential parking request. And once I've done that, now I can do a new step, and I can start pulling information. So I'll create a SharePoint create item, I think is what I'm looking for. There we go. So this is Microsoft Flow. I'm still getting used to it, but you tell it which form you want to pull from. You tell it what SharePoint Online site you want to pull into and what list you want to add it to. I'll just say test Cognito, and then once you've done that, it will give you the ability to add the information. Here's all the fields from my Cognito form that I can pull information in from and populate the different fields. In this case, this SharePoint Online list only has a couple of fields because I was testing with it. And then, of course, with Flow, you can manipulate variables, do calculations, all that kind of stuff, handle attachments and save in different places and so forth. So it's pretty flexible. And in addition, I thought I might mention, most or all of you probably already know, but I mean, you look at the Flow integrations here, and there's a lot of, well, you can do it later on after the presentation, but there's a lot of third-party hosted integrations here. So I really see Flow as being a flexible no-code solution for a lot of things that people may want to do that are kind of, again, the quick and dirty, not necessarily huge enterprise class things, but oftentimes you don't need that. So, and then I wanted to show you one last one, a use case where caveat, Cognito Forms is not designed for internal use. It's not really, that's not its sweet spot. It's public anonymous forms, in my opinion. That being said, it doesn't mean that you can't use it for internal uses. And here's an example of how we're using it on our intranet. Let's see. I want deferred comp. So here's our deferred compensation page, and we've added a little calculator here. So this is a SharePoint on-prem. This is using the seamless embed code. Let's say, we'll give ourselves $12,000 a month. How's that? Our union, and how much, maybe we'll take out $500 per pay period, and we want to see what's going to happen if we take $600 out per pay period, and which pay period, and then I'll give you the calculation of, this is where the city matches contributions for your deferred compensation, let's say, and it will calculate that and let you email you a version of it. So while it's not intended for really targeting internal forms, there are some potential limited use cases where you can have non-authenticated or non-identified people submitting it. That is the major drawback of doing it this way is that there's no real user context, right? So it's not aware of which Active Directory user is filling out the form when it's submitted. So that's why there's sort of limited use case. But I did want to highlight that you could find some specific uses internally if you wanted to. You can also host it embedded online in SharePoint Online. I would not recommend that yet, just because you can do it, but it's iframed. So it's not the seamless code, it's the iframed version. And unlike other content management systems that support iframing, SharePoint Online steps on a lot of toes when you iframe stuff, in my opinion. So it's just not as seamless of an experience. To answer that, Cognito Forms is looking at providing a native modern web part for Cognito Forms in SharePoint Online. It's on their dev roadmap. So there's no ETA yet, but it is on their roadmap. So great question on the public request. Yes, you can capture all of the information from a Cognito form and push it into a SharePoint list, and you could do public disclosure requests off of SharePoint. The only exception I would say there is if people are really highly technical and they know what they're doing, they could potentially ask for some metadata that wouldn't be as easily transferred, or you probably wouldn't want to bother transferring it just because of the unlikeliness that they're unlikely to request that kind of information. That just the subject matter and the actual information is what they're looking for usually. But like if there's an investigation or something like that, you might have to go in and dig in and get that information separately. because it probably wouldn't be worth your time. There wouldn't be a good business case for transferring all of the metadata from a Cognito form into a SharePoint list, in my opinion. Great question. So lastly, on the integration point, we are exploring the idea of using Cognito Forms as a front end for public forms to integrate with line of business systems. So for example, our on-base document management system does not have a robust public anonymous form solution. It has internal robust form solution and an internal robust workflow engine. It just doesn't really have a great public forms designer. So we're looking at potentially using that. Cognito does have an API where you can pull data from Cognito Forms. It does not require Microsoft Flow. You can actually hit the API and pull it. One of the limitations of Cognito Forms is you can't do the reverse of that yet. They're still working on webhooks, dynamic webhooks, where you could pull information from your line of business systems into a Cognito form. So that's still on their dev roadmap, but you can certainly pull data out of the system, or push data out of the system. It uses JSON as the integration point. All right. I'll quickly go over, we've got about, 10 minutes-ish? I'll go over pricing real quick with you, show you what that is. I'm going to speed things up here too. So free, give it a try. It's pretty cool. It's really easy to sign up. I use it personally in outside of business because it's free and it's easy to use. I would recommend at least going to the Teams if I were you for business production, which is still super cheap, like $300 or something like that. If you do a yearly, you get a discount, by the way. We're doing the enterprise, and the two key reasons why we went enterprise, notice that the forms are unlimited here, but you start getting into entries and storage. With photos and things like that, we felt like the storage, but also two key points for enterprise, folder permissions and HIPAA compliance. So they'll actually sign an agreement with you for HIPAA compliance and then folder permissions so that we can allow distributed authoring of forms throughout departments for simple surveys and things like that they want to create online that don't have integrations and things like that. They can just create simple forms. We wanted to be able to protect the forms from different, particularly some entries are sensitive, like police tips and things like that. That's that, and then I'll do a quick and dirty of the tool itself. I'm not familiar specifically with CGIS compliance, but it has HIPAA compliance, and in our mind, that was in our use case was adequate. So here's the forms designer. You can see the different folders here and all of our forms. We're still getting started, but some of the most popular ones: public records requests, surprise, surprise; police tips, surprise, surprise. Some of these are just getting started. But I'll do a new form. I'll just copy it from an existing template that we've created. And I'll flip over to, I use dark mode on my browser. I'll flip over to what it normally looks like. So my form, and then it's just, drag and drop. So you got your fields here. You can reorder them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because you guys can play with this yourself. But it does conditional formatting, so show this when such and such contains, you get the idea. You can also go more advanced and get really, if you want to get more real tricky with it. Let's see, on the submission side, you can do notifications for like internal staff. So you can do from to, you can attach documents. You can include, this is kind of interesting because it'll include a PDF version of the form in addition if you wanted to. We have used that in some cases where people would rather have the PDF, and what they do is they literally take the PDF and insert it into like the online permitting system or something like that. So they'll use it as a document to transfer the information to the line of business system instead of rekeying and not having to deal with an actual integration between SharePoint, for example, and the third-party product or the line of business system maybe. This simple entry details, like Nintex Live, there was no way, on-prem anyway, there was no way to like give a notification and include all of the form information in the email itself without manually adding every single field. It was a kind of a pull our hair out more than once about that. This is what I was talking about the JSON, so you can push data to other systems. But here's the Microsoft's implementation. Super simple. So you give the URL, username, password, And for those who might be using multi-factor authentication for SharePoint Online, for example, it does support app passwords, so that's supported. I highly recommend using a service account that's specialized for that. And there's a way you can provide permissions on the SharePoint side that limits it to just specific actions on the list for security measures. And let's see. Oh, in order to, so you point it here, how do you know which field goes where? When you're building the form, let's save this to test. When you build the form, all you need to do is match the label of the field with the column name in SharePoint. So there's a 1-to-1 ratio. So if you go into the form, show you what I mean by that. Let's do this one. So if I call this title, you know, that's gonna populate the title field in the list. If you want to fill out, if you want to have fields on the form that go into different column names, you can certainly do that, but you'd have to use hidden fields on the form to pre-populate those. Or if you're using SharePoint Online, you can use the flow option, and then you can map any field to any field in SharePoint. They don't have to match. So super simple there, no coding, and like I said, you can push that. You can push that to SharePoint on-prem, SharePoint Online, or Flow. So Flow pulls it, but the send to SharePoint is pushing it to on-prem or online through that process. Super simple, easiest one I've seen so far. Cascading drop-downs, I'm going to say yes. If you look up on Cognito's site, I'll refer you to that because we only have a couple minutes left, but yes, it supports cascading. Publishing it, I'm going to save changes here. This is where I was talking about using the seamless code. This right here works really well on most websites. The iframing is my second choice. And you can do some style editing of colors and things like that. It's pretty basic though, you're not going to get too fancy. You can throw images on the form itself and things like that and have a logo which can be included in the email notifications and so forth. On entries, it gives you, let me go to, I actually created a, what was it? It was prepared one. It was vacation. It was report. Oh, it was abandoned vehicles, I think. Nope. We'll have to edit that one out. I was just going to show you, oh, I know, public disclosures. That's what I did. Public records requests. I just wanted to make sure I hid the personal details of people. So here you can change the different columns that show up. You can export to Excel. You can create a new entry. You can do some basic status, like whether it's submitted or reviewed or completed. You can do, again, notifications through conditional formatting with the form. When you get notifications, you can say, if this field contains this value, then notify so-and-so. So there's some very basic workflow and notification that you can do, but what I found is oftentimes I want to do that kind of workflow and notifications and status updates in SharePoint and workflow in SharePoint itself. But this kind of gives you a view of what the entries look like. So direct access to the data, which is great, and filtering and so forth. All right. I think that's all I had on the product demo. I'm not seeing any other questions on the product. I'm going to flip back over to my last couple of slides here. So how do we feel about Cognito 6 months later? So it took, we're feeling pretty good about it. It took us about 10 hours to rebuild all of our Nintex live forms. So that was a pretty quick turnaround. 10 hours meaning filtered in amongst several weeks of other work assignments and so forth, but basically 10 hours of work. The vendor support is fantastic. I usually get same-day responses, and email responses is usually what I use. They do have phone support. Documentation is good, and they actually published their enhancement list, their roadmap, which is kind of cool. I have a link to it on my resource slide in this presentation that you can look at, and you'll see it's warts and all. So yeah, it's not a perfect product. No product is, and they're not shy about that, and they publish what they're going to be working on. It's been perfect for email, quick forms to email solutions. So there may be times where a SharePoint integration is just not really needed, but they still need to capture specific information, and emails are fine because they get like 5 of them a week or something like that. It's been really quick Cognito. While it's not a Cognito to SharePoint integration, it certainly works really well for that. Online form to email solution. And then I mentioned that that it's for simple business processes has been working really well. As you get more involved, like for example, we tried to do something with integrating GIS online, and it wasn't really a good fit for that, for our online GIS system. And let's see here. Oh, so here's some I mentioned warts earlier. Here's a couple things we ran into. If you get a bunch of rapid submissions on-prem, sometimes the integration will time out. And we're not sure if that's our farm or not. We haven't heard reports from other customers of theirs, so it may just very well be a setting on our farm. And the way we've solved that is we've just pushed it into online, SharePoint Online, and then we've had zero problems with it timing out online. So it may just be a resource issue on our side, but just wanted to be full disclosure about that. That is something we came across. Multiple iPhone file attachments. So if you're not aware, iPhones capture images, and they don't give them unique names. They say like image1 JPEG or something like that. I can't remember exactly the file name, but with the straight to SharePoint integration, it complains about that if you allow multiple file attachments on the same form. You can handle that with Microsoft Flow. So if you do the Flow integration, you can handle by renaming those attachments to adding the date, if you will, as a prepended file name. And then it lacks like I mentioned earlier, it lacks the dynamic webhooks to pull data from your systems into a Cognito form. So it'll do cascading drop-downs, but that's with pre-populated data that's on Cognito's forms building. You know, when you pre-populate that information, it's not real-time looking at that data from a line of business system. So, but that is on the vendor's roadmap. And then a couple things for the future. Microsoft Power Apps and Flow due out Q1. Sounds like it is out now, apparently. That's awesome. And then we think maybe combining that with Cognito Forms might mean most of our forms and workflow solutions for SharePoint Online. If they don't, we might take a second look at Nintex or K2 or things like that. But we're pretty shy about pricing and experience in the past. That being said, again, the full disclosure, Nintex Universal Forms, we did hear a promotional pricing of just the end of last year that they were offering 75 forms for $12K, which is a discount down from a little less than $40,000. That's per year, ladies and gents. That's a big pill to swallow. I mean, $12K isn't that bad necessarily, but it's also not unlimited forms, and it only includes 3 workflows. So still, pricing is still, you know, even with aggressive discounting and specials, it's still a little pricey. And so we'll look into that maybe in the future. FormStack could potentially, if they get a Flow integration, we might look at replacing Cognito with FormStack. FormStack is a more mature product, more robust, things like that, but it also comes with a price. So it's a little bit more expensive for the same quantity that we have with Cognito. And then Microsoft Office 365, they could potentially, you know, Microsoft may come up with a third solution. And then, of course, another product may come along. Cognito, I mentioned earlier, was founded in 2013, and they're where they're at now. So something could happen pretty rapidly, come out of the blue. And so that's what I see, at least from my perspective. And then also resource links. Here's a link to the Cognito Forms. There's a free plan, like I mentioned. You can give it a go. There's their enhancement request board. It's also linked to from their website, but I give a direct link in case you're interested in what they're working on. And then Nintex Universal Forms, I have not done a ton of research on that just because of the pricing at the time, but it does look very promising. So if you're looking for something that, if you're already a Nintex customer or you're looking for a Cognito alternative, that may be something that you might want to look into. And then just a couple quick notes. As part of our efforts last year, we did a Forms and Workflow Strategy project where we looked at a bunch of different products. If you're interested in those results, I'm happy to share those with you. Just email me, zip me an email at webmaster@cuba.org, and I'll send those out to you. And then also specifically, Gravity Forms, FormStack, and Cognito, we did a pretty detailed features matrix, at least in 2018. We haven't refreshed it for this year, but what their features were available so that we could make a decision, and maybe that'll help you make yours. That's what I had. So hopefully you found some value in that. Any questions? We can certainly, we're at time, but we can certainly answer questions if people want to stay on the call. And we might even, Joe, if you're okay with it, we can just open up to audio questions so people don't have to type.
Absolutely. Stephen, that was great. That was
Great.
very in-depth.
Hopefully people got some value out of it.
I'm curious, you didn't mention Microsoft Forms. I know it's a very immature product. Doesn't have a lot of the features that people are looking for, but was that at all in your evaluation list?
It was, yeah. I mentioned it in the presentation, but only briefly earlier on in an earlier slide. And we looked at it, and it was pretty basic. So it was, simple surveys, things like that. It didn't really have the full functionality that we were looking for in a forms designer.
Right.
That being said, I wanted to be clear. I don't want to discount it. If your need is very, very simple, like a contact form or something like that, perhaps it would, or a simple survey, it may very well be what you need. But the price point for Cognito versus the functionality, to us it was kind of a no-brainer.
I think there's also some other challenges around forms for governance and trying to create a solution that's managed appropriately by an IT team, which is kind of a challenge. But you could imagine that solution becoming more built out in the next few years.
Yeah, and one of the nice things is, quite frankly, it's $1,000 a year. If something comes out better, if there's no huge contract that we're locked into, it's pretty easy to migrate forms. In our opinion, it's no loss if we do migrate off of this product. But we found it a useful tool for now.
I also looked into kind of the history of the company too, and I found out they were, they come from a SharePoint consulting shop. So it's
interesting.
Yeah, they really know what they're doing, and they specifically target cities, counties, municipal districts, water districts, that sort of thing. So they definitely hit all the important points.
Yeah, I was doing some because we were going to go with them. We were doing some deeper research and found out they got around to funding for a couple of years ago, some more funding for their company to expand, things like that. But it'll be interesting to see where they go.
Yeah.
I think people are hungry. I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, well, I think most people
no
ate
other
lunch.
questions. I'm happy to stay on if other people want to discuss other topics for SharePoint, that kind of thing. I'll kind of take off my presenting hat and turn on my participant hat. So thanks everyone. I appreciate your participation.
So any general questions about SharePoint or Office 365 that people want to talk about?